I'd like to introduce you guys to our keynote speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce her. As our closing keynote speaker, Dr. Theresa Isa Arriola. She's also the chair of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. Dr. Arriola was born and raised on Saipan and is a social cultural anthropologist who earned her doctorate from the University of California at LA. She received her bachelor's from Brown University and her master's degree from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her dissertation, entitled Securing Nature, Militarism, Indigeneity, and the Environment in the Northern Mariana Islands, focuses on the contemporary experiences of Chamorro and Rafalawash people in the CNMI as they navigate the U.S. military's many environmental planning processes. Dr. Arriola employs an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how processes of militarization transform the social political realities of indigenous peoples and environments in the contemporary Marianas by drawing from anthropology, indigenous studies, Pacific Island studies, and political ecology. Her talk today is entitled The Worlds We Navigate, Reimagining Magellan Through the Lens of the Marianas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Theresa Isa Arriola.
Thank you so much, Leo, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to say how amazing that video we just watched was, and I'm so proud to see that it came out of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, and to all of the people that made that video come to life. I just am so impressed. And so with that, Hafaday, everybody, good evening. And I don't want to say we're kind of at the end of this meeting, but welcome to the end of yet another beginning, I'll call it, of the conversations that we've been having, that the conversations we'll be having long after the conference is over. I'd just like to start out by thanking the steering committee of the Marianas History Conference, in particular the co-chairs, Dr. Carlos Madrid, Ms. Lavon Guerrero-Meno, and the entire Marianas History Conference team, as well as the partners that helped make this virtual and very global event a beautiful success, and to the technical team as well for making this as seamless as could possibly be in this virtual Zoom platform. And lastly, I just want to extend a very sincere appreciation to all of the attendees, the presenters, and the hosts too of this really dynamic and inspiring conference that we've been experiencing over the last 10 days. This is the 10th day. It's really an honor to be here talking alongside all of you, many of whom I consider to be heroes, personal heroes in so many ways. And so I have to say that I've been so impressed by not only the kind of depth of the conversations that we've been having, but the real breadth of the issues that we've been covering. And so, you know, all of the knowledge and experiences and participation, it has centered on such a diverse range of topics. And before I jump in any further, let me go ahead and share screen with you here. Oh, you see my screen, don't you? Let me enlarge it. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay, great, awesome. So as I was saying, you know, the topics that we've been covering have spanned everywhere from heritage to seafaring to language to decolonization, all of the topics that are just really perfectly fitting for this theme, 500 years, navigating 500 years of cross-cultural contact. And so I know Leo already introduced me, but let me just introduce myself. My name is Isa Arriola. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I was born and raised here on this beautiful island of Saipan in the CNMI. And I come to this conference with a really deep interest in our people's contemporary experiences with many of the processes that Magellan opened up the doors to, including the process of militarization, which I'll touch on in a second. But please, if you will, just allow me to tell you a very short story about how this interest kind of started. So growing up on Saipan, like so many others here, you know, we're so used to seeing the remnants of World War II just everywhere. When people come to visit, we like to take them up to Marpi, for example. You know, we go to Banzai Cliff, Suicide Cliff. We swim in the waters near tanks. We have mementos left over from the war that we keep in our homes and outside. And I often share this picture. Sorry. I often share this picture of this large bombshell that my family brought with us when we moved from Navy Hill to San Vicente, to really showcase this kind of personal sense of the connection that many of these different remnants of war have to us, in the way that they just become kind of part of our daily life. And so often, as many of us know, the experiences of war and the stories of war that are passed down, at least to my generation, really revolve around the commemoration, you know, of World War II, and it's so thoroughly naturalized in our landscapes, in our family conversations, and in our daily experiences. So this was a kind of experience I never really gave much thought to at all. And so when I left for college, this was all the way in Rhode Island. For the first time, I signed up for this class called War and Society. And, you know, I was expecting to learn about the history of war, and being from a place that figured so centrally into this broader American World War II history narrative, I thought, you know, why not? Surely I'll learn something relevant from this course. I'm going to go ahead and take it. So one day during a class, the professor, who happened to be a militarism scholar, Dr. Catherine Lutz, she pulls up a picture of Guahan. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, wow, I flew all the way, you know, out here to Rhode Island. There's a picture of Guahan right in front of me. What is this doing here, you know? But instead of talking about the island's strategic location or its kind of significance as a site of World War II or a major battlefield, she talked about something entirely different. And so what she did was she began to note the way that the Marianas was one of the many sites on the globe that comprised an integral part of the acceleration of US militarization. And this was a perspective that really framed the global importance of our islands in this broader structure of U.S. global base building, this U.S. global base building enterprise abroad. And she started to connect this discussion with a lot of other places on the planet where dispossession of other indigenous peoples throughout the globe went kind of hand in hand with this increased militarization. And so the story, you know, began to not be so unique. And when I kind of reflect on this origin story, as it were, for me at least, you know, it's not so shocking now, but this was about 15 years ago when I first heard her talk about the Marianas this way. And so it was truly a realization that kind of blew my mind. So I thought to myself, you know, how could we be living amongst so much militarization and not see it in this way? And what these initial perspectives taught me was about the ways that our so-called small islands are connected to much broader processes. And this really inspired me to engage in long-term ethnographic fieldwork on the ground, so to speak. You know, I was really interested in hearing from the perspectives of our people here, to work to better understand the way that contemporary militarism, so not just like the story or history of World War II, but how contemporary militarism was transforming our social lives here in the Northern Marianas. And in this way, I was following the kind of call that Dr. Lutz described as this urgent need to produce what she called ethnographies of empire, that moved away from World War II as this spectacle or commemorative event and move more towards an understanding of a slow violence, as Rob Nixon would put it, that characterized our society today. In particular, I was really interested in the way that contemporary military renderings of the Marianas as open, as realistic, and strategic, and the way that stewardship was being used to describe military plans in our waters and skies. And by now, all of these terms really have kind of become commonplace, common sense descriptions to describe our surrounding environments. We say strategic or geostrategic all the time without really worrying about the kind of geographic determinism that we are assigning to these islands in regards to their military use value when we use those terms. And so from this work, one of the arguments that I often make is that there's a sort of naturalization of militarism that occurs during the military's many environmental planning processes through the release of their multiple environmental impact statements that many of us have become familiar with living out here, that really take the environment to be this kind of thing that's impacted rather than something that's co-constructed or always in the making. And far from being this singular thing, from this perspective, the environment is truly a site where power moves. And in particular, I've wanted to highlight the way that this framing continues to override Indigenous connections to place. And what are the consequences of framing the environment in this way, for example? Well, to say that something is open renders it free for the taking. It renders it empty. To say that our environments are realistic, for example, means to make the case that they are destroyable, that they're able to be destroyed. And to say that the environments are strategic renders them pretty much irreplaceable. And it perpetuates this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of military planning. And so I share all of this with you to give you a sense of how these experiences have really shaped my journey here and how they're intimately connected to so many of the themes in this conference. And because of these interests, I really came to this year's conference with a kind of excitement and an anticipation to learn more about the ways that we as peoples in the Marianas, whether it's those who call this place an ancestral home, a home now, or those that have kind of made it a home or study this place, to learn from those whose voices comprise all of these stories of this place, of this beautiful archipelago whose histories have been overlain now by 500 years of so many kind of other interpretations of who we are, including with the initial naming of the islands and the way that we're made visible to the rest of the world. So let me switch the slide here. So leading up to the conference, I had been reading a lot about Magellan circumnavigation, which was viewed as one of these kind of first globalized events in world history, and how it, quote, put us on the map, so to speak, when he sailed these vast and unknown seas and came across the Marianas. And the tensions over how to kind of commemorate Magellan are very apparent, from South America to Philippines to the Marianas. And being mindful of the way that history often glosses over Indigenous perspectives, and mindful of this erasure, there was so much tension, And so this conference really slowly has kind of navigated the meaning of these discrepancies and how we can learn with and from these encounters without losing sight of what's at stake in this history of decolonization where we find ourselves. So, our conference description even noted this. It said, after Magellan first reached our archipelago in 1521, these complex interactions triggered a number of consequences for our islands, being placed on world maps, the visits in succeeding years by other explorers, and eventually triggering an intense and difficult process of colonization that in some respects continues to this day in Guam and in other parts of the Pacific that are still among the last colonized people on Earth. And so, when I read this and when I read a lot about the coverage, the thing that struck me right away was that in this understanding of Magellan's journey, the Magellan-Elcano journey, it was he that was seen as connecting us to the rest of the world. But of course, in saying that his journey put us on the map, this produces a kind of cartographic rendering of the region that does violence to the Marianas in so many ways and our peoples by simplifying our place on this globe and the significance of our histories of movement within this vast oceanic region. So hearing this week about the exciting new archaeological research being done on Guahan and in the Sinamai that locates the DNA of the first people to permanently settle here by the works of Dr. Rosalind Hunter Anderson and Miss Joan Eakin, and listening to Dr. Cunningham on Wednesday, actually last week, about the ways that our Austronesian ancestors populated the Marianas thousands of years ago, and the way that we remain these distinct populations of people always becoming. In Dr. Cunningham's words, he said this beautiful phrase, always becoming tomorrow. It reminds us of that deep and enduring connection that we have to this place that existed, of course, long before Magellan came into the picture, and it continues to change and evolve. So to put on the map means to make one known. But of course, the question then becomes known to who? When we center Magellan, the Marianas becomes just this small, tiny kind of stopover in this much broader picture of conquest, a perspective that really has set off a much longer trajectory of this colonial imaginary that laid the groundwork for much of the way the region has been subsequently understood and continues to today. And this immediately reminded me of the way that Pacific scholar Apeli Ha'ofa described what he called the, quote, discovery of the Pacific, when he wrote, continental men, namely Europeans, on entering the Pacific, after crossing huge expanses of ocean, introduced the view of islands in a far sea. From this perspective, islands are tiny isolated dots in a vast ocean. Later on, continental men, Europeans and Americans, drew imaginary lines across the sea, making the colonial boundaries that confined ocean peoples to tiny spaces for the first time. And he is a person that I use a lot to kind of think through the way that this colonial imaginary has really framed this region. I know Julian Agun touched on him when he was talking about his book. And, just that his work, although it's often quoted, still is so relevant for helping us kind of think outside of this, this box, this insularity. So now the question then becomes, what happens when we center the stories of the Marianas? Well, the possibilities of interpreting Magellan's encounter are expanded far beyond the scope of the voyage, beyond the Marianas as a stopover, and it provides a kind of nuance and a different kind of connection. And so this year's 5th Marianas History Conference, like the others before it, center the stories of the indigenous peoples and visitors who call this place home, and it makes room for a different imagining, a reimagining of what Magellan and his journey means to us. For some, in this process, this has meant reclaiming language and engaging in placemaking by exploring the origins and identifying place names, for example, In the Northern Marianas or Ghani, as we've seen in this conference, Dr. Stolz highlighted the importance of the recovery of so many of the missing place names that never made it onto the maps, for example. And that was such an interesting presentation. You know, we were even able to kind of visit Ghani virtually, so the Northern Islands, with the introduction of Representative Layla Staffler's film. And that's a trip that I know many of us in this community hope to undertake in person someday as part of this journey of discovering our connections to these sacred spaces. So in this regard, to rename is to really reclaim, and an important part of what it means to decolonize place. This search for appropriate place names last week really, or the week before, really provoked a lot of discussion on the part of the audience about the knowledge that was gleaned from the Manamco and all of the others before us about the spaces that have been rendered nameless or invisible in the kind of subsequent process of colonial regimes. For others in this conference, this really meant tapping into ancient knowledge of navigation and exploring the importance of the sea as a site of knowledge production, but also to explore the sea as this shared space between ourselves and others, and the other species that we share this archipelago with as well. And this is really what I appreciate so much about the knowledge that this conference produces, that it's not that these talks are just kind of presentations, but they're really opportunities for the community to kind of dialogue, heal, talk about their knowledge too. And so these conversations and these conference themes have themselves given us a kind of knowledge of the different worlds that we inhabit, the different worlds. Not that singular world that Magellan was seeking to discover, but the worlds that we make in our homes, in our unique villages, and in our individual islands. So in the worlds that define the Marianas Archipelago, I want to point to two emergent themes that I felt really characterized the discussion in this year's conference. And these themes really speak to the stakes of having a space like this for us to wrestle with the legacy of Magellan. Let me turn on my light real quick. 1 second. I realized it started to get dark there. Sorry about that. So the first of these terms is what's called imperial formations. And so this is a term that was coined by anthropologists Laura Ann Stoller and Carol McGranahan. And the second is what a lot of Native scholars in both North America and throughout the Pacific have been calling indigenous resurgence. So, you know, these aren't necessarily new, you know, kind of words, but they're so relevant for what we're talking about here. So let me first clarify how I see the emergence of imperial formations in the conversations that we've been having over the last 10 days. So to understand imperial formations means to focus less on the conquest of empire, like the ones that characterize Magellan, the Magellan-Elcano voyage, for example, and more on what Laura Stoller and Carol McGranahan describe as the, quote, active and contingent process of empires making and unmaking that informs our contemporary realities. So this perspective really kind of brings empire into the present. In other words, it's not just about kind of commemorating a legacy of what colonialism was or what it might have looked like back then. It's about how these formations manifest in our everyday lives. So importantly, they note that imperial formations thrive off of what they call deferred autonomy. In other words, the unclarified sovereignties of US imperial breadth, unincorporated territories, trusteeships, protectorates, possessions. These are not the blurred edges of what more authentic, non-virtual visible empires look like, but variants on them rather. And so why is this important? So, you know, to talk about Magellan 500 years after the arriving to the Marianas, it seems like a very long time. And it might appear that we've kind of shed this colonial past or something that might have been, but isn't there now. And instead, what we see in this conference and in so much of what's happening in our communities is this constant reckoning with these imperial formations that may not be so obviously aligned with a kind of traditional colonialism in the past. And so, in other words, it's still here, it's unfolding. And Mr. Lotz's presentation really reminds us of this history and the formation of the Marianas from this kind of coaling station to this tip of the spear, as he describes it. So the second theme that I want to point to is this discussion of indigenous resurgence. And of course, this is a theme where we can find real global solidarity with other indigenous communities throughout the globe who are experiencing and have experienced similar histories of colonization, and in their own personal struggles to kind of reclaim and imagine what has been lost. And I picked this definition here. I mean, this is the definition that I have up here. And indigenous resurgence means to have the courage and imagination to envision life beyond the state. This is such an interesting definition, I think, because it means we're struggling through and we're thinking of ways of being that often exceed what has been envisioned for us by outsiders. We're thinking beyond political status. We're really trying to push towards that in this resurgence. And so there's a Cherokee scholar named Jeff Horntassel, and he says this about indigenous resurgence. And he's one of the scholars that talks about resurgence a lot. He says, whether they know it or not, or even want it, every indigenous person is in a daily struggle for resurgence. It is in these everyday actions where the scope of the struggle for decolonization is reclaimed and re-envisioned by indigenous peoples. And because decolonization is so integral to that kind of reimagining who we are as a people and how we are to connect with one another throughout the Marianas archipelago, you know, we sometimes forget about the kind of everyday ways and the kind of almost mundane ways that blend into the background in which indigenous resurgence continues to kind of manifest itself. And so Corntassel talks about this every day when he says this. He says, a significant part of everydayness is political awareness regarding ongoing colonization and the intentional daily processes we undertake to renew our relationships with homelands, waterways, cultural practices, and communities. And in this conference over the last 10 days and in our communities, you know, indigenous resurgence to me was absolutely everywhere. You know, I see this in the everyday work of the healers, the farmers, the artists, the music makers, and the language keepers, and all those that guard that knowledge. And the panel on the importance of musical traditions, for example, really, I think, speaks precisely to this issue of everyday, an ongoing cultural transmission, where even the sounds, you know, the uniqueness of the sounds of the Marianas can literally be heard through the Chamorro and Refalawash children's songs, for example, that Miss Melanie Hanka has brought to life. And so in this daily work, in this resurgence, this constant resurgence, where really all of us are participating, you know, again, whether we like it or not, in this collective work of reimagining. And so reimagining is another term that is a kind of subset under this resurgence here. But we have another scholar, Tai Alfred. He's a Kanyan Gehaga scholar. He writes that radical imagination is re-envisioning your existence on this land without the inherited privileges of conquest and empire. It is accepting the fact of a meaningful prior indigenous presence and taking action to support struggles not only of social and economic justice, but of political justice for indigenous nations as well. So, when we reimagine, I'm not, an important note I want to make is that this doesn't mean like, going back to some primordial past or some sort of pure past that never existed, never has existed, and never will. It means engaging with the movement of our culture as ever changing and of our people as ever changing resources rather than these kind of static entities, these things. So to reimagine means to center our perspectives in both the future, but also the way that we're interpreting the past, which has the conversation has revolved so much around in these last days. And this leads us to a kind of collective action as one archipelago, with the idea that what affects one island is really affecting us all. And as I watched the presentations on the panel entitled Towards Decolonization, and that panel had a really large audience, and perhaps one of the largest, I'm not sure, perhaps the largest. It showed the kind of concern of the community to be there. And we heard about these three options for Guahan's political future: statehood, free association, and independence. And this was by Mr. Dewey Huffer, Mr. Adrian Cruz, and Dr. Miguel Bivacqua, as well as Ms. Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero. And so sitting here from the vantage point of the CNMI and perhaps from the perspective of Ghani, this process really got me thinking about, decolonization through the lens of the entirety of the archipelago, not through the lens of this two political statuses that really kind of traps our mind. And this is why reimagining is so important. But what I realized is that when we see, what happens when we see the kind of collective survival of our people in all of our unique differences, not to say that we're this homogenous group, and in all of our unique differences, when we see ourselves in the same canoe, what happens to that? How do we reimagine? So if we're reimagining and we're thinking in this way, then decolonization, it becomes not just about a state sanctioned process and really more about reimagining of our histories, of our presents, and of our futures through the lens of an indigenous sovereignty, I might add, that isn't premised on this incorporated binary. So being able to reimagine allows us to kind of indigenize what that sovereignty is. And we can do that by basing it, moving it away from that binary and really basing it on the land and in the spaces that we inhabit and in the things that we consume from the land in our everyday lives and how we really, kind of move about that space. And by land, I don't just mean the physical land that, we stand on, but in more of a indigenous conceptualization of land as place, as inclusive of the air that we breathe and the waters that are quite literally a part of our very beings in our bodies. And in my research, I had the real privilege of interviewing my Ninu, my godfather, Manuel Borja, Uncle Manny Borja, as we call him, and as many of us know him, who's a respected Chamorro elder with a deep knowledge of our language and our customs. And he shared these beautiful words with me about our land and this place and this world. And I just kind of wanted to share that with you here in this discussion of land. He said, there are three things that have survived in our Chamorro culture related to respect. The first is respect to the ancestors. The second is respect for the land and nature. And the third is respect for each other, to those that are living, especially the elders. He continued, we know the ancestor spirits are there, that they don't cease to exist when they pass on, even embodying themselves in aspects of nature, and we are connected to them when we remember them. And then I asked him about the importance of land, specifically in the culture. He explained, similar to Rafalawash culture, In Chamorro, Tano doesn't just mean land, it means your place. I Tano means what is on earth, including things on the land like plants. It is akin to the English word world, he said. So to say tatatano, which translates literally into person, people of the land, means to say that you are acknowledging that that person is of that place. So I point to this conversation as a way to highlight the way that land remains so central to this reimagining and how we make sense of place in these worlds that we inhabit. As you've seen from so many of the panels, the importance of land. We've over the last 10 days, we've really witnessed a lot of this placemaking, a lot of this reimagining happening in so many different ways, in learning more about the kind of histories of our contact, and in the recuperation of ancient archaeological knowledge about where we've come from, where we're going, and where our people first settled. That knowledge is so deep. And also in the tremendous cultural knowledge that's being recuperated, I think, for younger generations, like in the language and the cultural practices that are being revived daily on the daily. I was just really impressed when I was watching the panel by Mr. Roman de la Cruz, his lively panel about the kind of revival of this ancient Chamorro art of slinging, for example. We come to this place and we find there's just so much knowledge here. Unlike so much of what we're used to hearing, about our culture, it's dying. And you come here and there's this reimagining, this replenishing. And, we also hear this reimagining in the voices of other generations, such as those that are captured by Arriola's and Seong Chung's presentations that really spoke to the kind of intergenerational struggle and the viewpoints that characterize their experiences with language, identity, and the interpretation of history. And I have to say, I was just so impressed that we got a chance to hear and listen from Seong. He's a high school student. This is really wonderful to hear these voices, all these different voices. So to kind of pick up from where previous conferences have left off, we're not only responsible for the revisioning. We've been working so hard to revise, to rewrite these histories, as Dr. Sauter reminded us, and of all of this retelling of our history. But we're the ones that are responsible for also sharing these histories, our narratives, and really sharing our worlds with one another and the world. So in our localized experiences that are often rendered as insignificant and very small in this kind of world that often accompanies the grand narrative of the Magellan Elcano voyage, we're deeply connected. And we know this, right, to others and to one another through these everyday stories that link us together, not only through space, but through time and through generations. And so if 2020 or 2021 now that we find ourselves in really has any kind of relation to Magellan, it's the fact that we're once again being connected on this planetary scale, but this time by the experiences of this pandemic and of all of these other kind of climactic forces that have always connected us, of course, but they're being highlighted once again, and they reminded us of the kind of deep indebtedness to one another that we have, whether we realize it or not. And I was, on Friday, I was watching the photos and the videos of Spain's Juan Sebastian Elcano Navy training vessel. I'm not sure if everybody got a chance to kind of see that, but it was following in Magellan's footsteps to commemorate his voyage, and it was met by the traditional Chamorro canoes on Guahan on Friday, and I couldn't help but think about the difference in this kind of welcoming in such a different era, that we live in. Yet what really kind of stood out to me and what touched me was that in this reenactment was persistence of our people, how we remained. And I want to juxtapose Magellan's maritime exploration here with the ancient oceanic-centered maritime knowledge, like the kind that's being reinvigorated here in the Marianas. It's truly, as you've just seen from that video, I mean, it is truly an amazing feat. And the way that 500 Sails is going about this, it's such an awesome thing to witness and be a part of in this time. So in this juxtaposition that I'm talking about here, you find that far from having conquered the sea, instead, what we see is that our people were humbled by the sea's power and its ability to connect us rather than, our ability to connect it. And I want to bring a sense of humility to the conversation amidst this conquering narrative, and one that's really rooted in this sense of respect, which is, of course, a core tenet of our Chamorro and Refalawash cultures, as Uncle Manny's words reflect, that allows us to kind of reimagine the planetary impact of our collective decision-making. And so from the lens of the Marianas, what Magellan's journey can teach us is that, our actions have consequences that go far beyond what we might even be able to imagine. And that's what I can take from this. And so we really have a kind of unique responsibility to remain committed to an everyday resurgence, this everyday slow, kind of resurgence that's very persistent, that remains this steady process of becoming, as Dr. Cunningham puts it, of becoming, that creates a different kind of mapping, a totally different kind of mapping for our children and the generations to come, perhaps, another 500 years from now, that are searching or are lost or, are looking for their place in these worlds. And so to close, I think I'll just share just this one more short story. While I was finishing up my degree, my husband and myself, we began to care for my late father now. And if you knew my father, he was a person that was filled with a lot, just tons of joy. And people still tell me that they remember him because they remember him either singing or laughing when he came by. And as he was slowly kind of leaving the earth, he said to me, "Isa, when I go, I know that when you look up into the sky, the brightest star that's shining down, just know this, the brightest star that's shining down is me. It's me looking at you." And so when he passed, I felt like the exact opposite had happened. I really felt like a bright star had basically burned out. And for a moment, it felt like everything he taught me was slipping away. The sense of death, it's slipping away. But after some time had passed and I kind of adjusted my gaze, instead of feeling like his star had really burned out, all of the other stars, the surrounding stars, started to kind of come into focus for me. And these were all the other stories and the people, like an ancient star map, really, of all of his constellations that he created during his life. And those began to shine down. And so when I think about this, it makes me think, about our children and as parents. I think about the constellations that were responsible, the stories that make these constellations that were responsible for making for them. And, I'll just go ahead and close with that by extending an invitation that in the next conference and in your conversations outside of this conference, in your everyday life, that you really continue to find the courage, to share your world. Again, there's no right or wrong here, but share your world, to map the experiences for the sake of us, that are living now, and for the sake of those in the future who should need that map if ever they want to find their way home. And so I'd like to go ahead and close there. I know we have some time for Q&A, but I just really want to, I know it's late on a Sunday, and I want to thank you again for allowing me to be here with you tonight. I look so much forward to the conversations again that are going to happen long after this conference is over, and also the laughter, to kind of humble ourselves again in this broader narrative, the laughter. I've learned such an incredible amount of information over these last 10 days, and on behalf of myself and the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, Sidzu'us Ma'asi, Olamwai, and thank you.
In the meantime, we get him back. I'll take the opportunity on behalf of Lavan Guerrero Meno and myself to thank Isa Arriola and Northern Marianas Humanities Council for these amazing closing remarks that somehow summarize the whole of the conference and remind us of the most relevant aspects of the presentation. We're very excited of the future ahead, of the, I would say, cultural scene and also political scene, and all the multiple perspectives that are coming in, and so inspiring. So it's so energizing to see the amount of effort that is being put together in this community struggle of survival, resurgence, and emphasis on indigenous perspectives, cultures, traditions, language, political status, etc. Isa, your presentation has been fantastic, and I would like to give also the floor to Ms. Lavan Guerrero Meno. In the meantime, we wait for Leo to address the Q&A sequence when we recover the sound from Saipan.
Testing.
There you go. There you go. We can hear you.
Okay, great. So back to the questions, Dr. Arriola from Tomas Manglonia. He asked, given the events unfolding at the Pacific Islands Forum, what do you think the role of regionalism will be in the years to come, and where does the Marianas sit in that next step?
You know, I hope we play a much larger role, you know, but one of the things that your question is kind of helping me think through is the way that, you know, the sea is really kind of, has always been and is still kind of transforming the way that we see our connections to one another. I know the APIL, the Association for Pacific Island Legislatures, for example, uses this idea of the blue continent, right? To kind of connect us all. And so I see the sea and the kind of reinvigoration of that connection to the sea as really playing a much larger role, very outwardly, in the way that we're kind of communicating with one another out here. And I hope the Marianas voice becomes, you know, more highlighted in a lot of these discussions. I believe we have observer status in a lot of these regional debates. So I'd love to see actually more representation from us there. I think we have a lot to say.
Okay, great. So our next question comes from Sandra Munton. She asked, Theresa, have you published anything related to what you have presented today?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So yes, there's a lot of things that are in the works. You know, I just recently obtained a PhD, and what I've really tried to do with this work is kind of break it down, you know, writing a bit about ocean governance in the CNMI and how all the different kind of layers of US hegemony in the region overlay, again, indigenous kind of placemaking in this region. I also have an article that will be coming out soon about sovereignty, and a chapter actually about sovereignty and the way that I envision a kind of sovereignty for the CNMI that's kind of based off of what I talked about, but this idea that, you know, it shouldn't be so much connected to this political status, but when we think of kind of indigenizing sovereignty, what that allows us to do, you know, what that allows us to see in our political future that might be kind of outside the bounds of political status, for example. You know, there's just so much that our communities are really thinking through, and it's a really exciting and kind of terrifying moment at the same time where we find ourselves here. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is capture that moment. Thank you.
Okay, and we have another question from Michael Clements Sr. He also gives his regards to Mr. Manny Borja. And his question is indigenous or Spanish identity? And this came at around the slide where you had a quote from a member of the Cherokee Nation.
He was indigenous.
Okay.
Yeah. In North America, yeah.
Okay, great. And Sandra thanks you for her answer. And as we give perhaps a couple of more minutes for folks to chime in with questions, I'd like to just read out some of the comments here. Let's see, we have a comment from Lawrence Cunningham. Dr. Arriola, thank you for your insightful presentation. Hope Cristobal says, so proud of you, Isa, congratulations. Lawrence Cunningham again says, Dr. Arriola, I hope you enjoy this poem from my talk last Thursday, through colonization, through pandemics and wars, surviving yet and joyfully, flourishingly and never ever giving up. Chamorros, all chamorros. And Melanie Hanka says, indigenous resurgence is now going into my vocabulary forever. Lyle Mook says, Isa, you bring a re-enchantment to all the other re-words of reimagining, resurgence, reinvigorating that are so vital. Thank you for your wonderful work and moving things forward. You carry so much of your father's passion and joy. Jazz Anastasio says, Uncle Ned, what a light in life, in legacy and in you. Eulalia Arriola says, beautiful presentation, Dr. Isa. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your personal stories. Hope Cristobo says, Gof Namaguf. Enhorabuena, Isa. Theresa Terlahi says, beautiful tying together. Right. Rika de la Cruz says, I learned so much. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Rita Pangolina Nauta, Biba Dr. Isa, Biba Mantautautanu, Biba Marianas, Sidus Maasi, Northern Marianas. Sinta Kaipat says, Olomwai, Sidus Maasi, and thank you, Dr. Isa Arriola. Great closing remarks, Biba. Dr. Kimberly Keeling of Humanities Guahan, wonderful and insightful presentation, Isa. Thank you so much. Dr. Laura Sauder, Sen gof menhalum y cuentosmu, who agradeci todo. From Dr. Liz Rehebe, wonderful summing up and perspective on all the presentations, as well as your personal notes of what is to come. Sizus Masi. So Dr. Michael Clements Sr. clarifies that his question was about Chamorro identity. Is it indigenous or Spanish?
If I understand his question correctly, you know, indigenous can be, you know, it's Spanish. I mean, if from here, you know, through our connection here, you know, what our indigeneity is a very mixed bag if you're looking at it from a kind of, you know, bloodline. But yeah, so, you know, I have a very kind of broad understanding of what indigeneity is, in part because I don't, you know, just assign a kind of strict blood quantum rule to that idea. Again, you know, as I mentioned, our culture, our identities, they change, and so does indigeneity, and so will it. And, you know, so thinking about kind of in the future, what we want indigeneity to be is part of this question, and a part of a way to kind of, so he says, oh no, so I'm not changing the definition of indigeneity at all. It is what it is, you know. It's just how we express that indigeneity is what I'm referring to here.
Okay, so Isa, it looks like we have no further questions, and this is about the best time to bring your presentation to a close. Thank you so much for tying everything together. Of course, being a participant as well throughout this conference and absorbing everything and helping us all put that into perspective. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Carlos Madrid and Lavan Guerrero Meno to bring final closure to our conference here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you, Isa. Lavan, I think Leo has said it quite well. This has come to an end, and I think it's time to thank all the participants, all the presenters for the amount of joy, the much we have all learned, the amount of information shared, the pleasure of working along with Leo Pangilinan, with the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, and of course with all the steering committee members. Lavan, now if I'm on a roll, I'm going to mention all, just to prevent I'm forgetting someone, but please let me know, because I tend to forget. We also counted with Kimberly Killen from Humanities Wahan, President Frankie Elíptico from the Northern Marianas College, Lawrence Camacho, Mike Clement Jr., Rita Nauta from Guampedia, Joe Kinata from the Guam Preservation Trust, and Dean Monique Story from the University of Guam. Lavan, you want to go and say a few words?
So yeah, the burning question now is what now? What now? And so, well, we hope that these presentations have inspired you to think about our island and our people in a new way. We also hope that it drew out new questions. And with that, we challenge you to use those questions as a springboard to your own research about our beautiful islands and people, and to present it at the 6th Marianas History Conference with the overarching theme, One Archipelago, Many Stories.
Many stories.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a wonderful experience.
It's been wonderful indeed. Well, right before we go, we'll mention also in short our sponsors, the Guam Preservation Trust, Dr. Hiro Kurasina, GTA Guam, and the Bank of Guam. The Micronesian Area Research Center is indebted to the University of Guam Global Learning and Engagement, most particularly to Daniel Ragalmar, Amanda Blas, Luigi Bansil, and Camille Masilungan. To all of you and participants and registrars, as Ms. Lavan has said, we look forward to see you on the 6th Marianas History Conference. This is all.